AI Policy Labs is a global public policy think tank dedicated to exploring the role of artificial intelligence and the emerging technologies in advising global challenges, taking into account the challenges posed by technology. Welcome to our podcast series on AI for SDGs, focusing on SDG 10 today, and thank you for joining us. Today we have with us Dr. Brent Mittelstadt. He's a senior research fellow and a British academic postdoctoral fellow in data ethics at the Oxford Internet Institute, a Turing fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, and a member of the UK National Statistician's Data Ethics Advisory Committee. Thank you very much to being here with us. So firstly, could you take us through what SDG 10, reduce inequality, entails, and what possible elements of inequality are we talking about?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I can walk you through SDG 10 and what it entails. So at the high level, it is about reducing inequalities both within and between countries. So this could be between, say, developing and developed countries. But it can also be inequalities that exist within the population of a given country. And even developed countries still have very significant levels of inequality among different groups within society. So the sorts of inequalities we're talking about would be things that are based on income, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, class, religion, these sorts of things. And they would be in particular affecting groups that have been historically marginalized. And one of the groups that are particularly two of the groups that are particularly highlighted within SDG 10 are refugees and migrants, quite often who are subject to discriminatory forms of policymaking or decision-making, or just are faced with policies that limit their access to things like education, employment, high-paying jobs, these sorts of things. So it's both inequality between countries and inequality within countries in terms of inequality among the different groups within a society. And there's lots of examples of what that actually looks like in practice. So taking an example in the United Kingdom, we recently had a case where we had to predict the outcomes of exams. This was referred to as the off-qual algorithm case. Essentially, because of the disruption caused by COVID, there was a need to predict what students would have gotten on their A-level exams. And to do that, algorithm was used that based the predictions on the historical performance of schools. And what that ended up resulting in was basically discriminatory outcomes, lower predicted marks being assigned to schools that were in particular areas of the country. In general, poorer schools were given lower predicted marks. And so as a result, you had inequality on the basis of class, on the basis of income, and in practice on the basis of ethnicity. So that's the sort of thing we're talking about here. It's just inequalities that affect different groups within a society and how to reduce those over time.
Yeah, I know the A-level is actually an important issue in the COVID, in the UK. Okay, next question. We know your research concerns digital ethics in relation to machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, and medical expert systems, even data protection and privacy law. So in your view, what role would AI play with respect to the achievement of SDG 10? I mean, will AI reduce or exacerbate inequality within and among countries?
Yeah, it can be used to do both. So the example I just gave of the off-qual algorithm was an example where it was exacerbating existing inequalities within society rather than helping to fix them. Whether it reduces inequalities or exacerbates inequalities is really a question of how systems are designed, how they are designed to tackle things like inequality in society. You know, are they designed, for example, with fairness in mind? Are they using training data or just data in general that is representative of the population that the system will be used on? Is the system being retrained when it's used on different populations or in different contexts than where it was originally trained? These are the sorts of choices that are made around the design and training of AI systems that will determine whether they're going to have a positive or a negative effect in terms of inequality. And that's really when we're talking about inequality within countries. If we are using AI for any sort of decision-making that could have a significant effect on a person's life. So education is one example, but it could be policing, it could be financial decision-making, it could be with regards to access to education or employment, then you have this risk of it basically making things worse than they currently were. And what's interesting is that is essentially this question is a central concern within the field of fair machine learning. There's been widespread recognition that AI systems, if nothing is done, basically if we don't think about fairness, if we don't think about bias within our systems, that they can exacerbate existing inequalities and even create new inequalities. And so the research in the space of fair machine learning is tasked with both conceptualizing and quantifying that inequality and measuring the impact that AI has on it, but then also identifying ways to reduce the impact of AI, again, on exacerbating existing inequalities, or even with a positive effect to make things fairer in society or more equal in society. And there's a piece of work that I've done recently that looks at exactly that question, and specifically in the many different ways that we can quantify fairness, that we can measure fairness in statistical terms when we're dealing with AI. A very important decision that needs to be made by the designer of the system is whether they're going to measure fairness in a way that takes the status quo for granted, that basically treats the status quo with all of its inequalities that exist in society, whether it treats that as a neutral starting point to measure fairness and to make decisions going forward, or if the system will instead take historical inequalities into account, take these existing inequalities between groups into account, and start from that point to measure fairness going forward. And the distinction there would essentially be between whether we're pursuing equality as a positive thing by using AI, whether we're trying to use AI to actually fix things in society that are currently broken, or if we're going to act as though we are happy with how society is in terms of inequality between groups, and then just try to not make things any worse than they currently are. This is essentially the difference between formal and substantive equality in terms used in non-discrimination law, or in the terms I use, the difference between bias preserving fairness and bias transforming fairness. So yes, AI can do both. It can reduce inequality, it can exacerbate inequality. It all depends on how it's designed and how it's used in any given context.
Okay. Third question, as you said, AI can do both, but we have to talk about what is the best way to implement AI in less developed countries to ensure that they are not left behind in the AI transition.
Yeah, so two things. I mean, one just very quickly builds on my last answer in the sense of I would always advocate for implementing if we're thinking about fairness and inequality in relation to AI, I would always advocate for using bias transforming fairness or bias transforming fairness metrics so that we are pursuing substantive equality between groups within a country rather than taking existing inequalities for granted and treating the status quo as neutral. So that's the one thing. But then the second thing is that there's potentially an opportunity in implementing AI in less developed countries that doesn't exist when we're talking about AI in the space of developed countries. And it's basically a opportunity to get things right from the start rather than trying to implement AI on an existing complicated bureaucratic or socio-technical system or socio-technical institution. And so what I mean by that, I'll just use an example again from the UK. The UK has been trying to digitize the National Health Service in a uniform way for a very long time. They spent a very significant amount of money going back to at least the National Project for IT, which was many years ago. But there's been repeated attempts to basically get all the different institutions that are involved with the NHS using the same information systems. So having the same sorts of databases, the same sort of patient tracking and appointment booking systems, and basically have one type of IT system for the entire NHS. And it's been really, really difficult to do that because you've had pockets or you've had regional networks or even local networks of NHS institutions develop over time, and as a result develop their own norms, develop their own information systems they're using, develop their own best practices. And so when you're trying to implement a uniform approach or a uniform set of information systems across those different regional networks that are very diverse in how they're using information technology, you run into this problem of, well, how do you choose which is the right approach? And then how do you get those regional networks to actually adopt the uniform system that you are pushing? It's a very, very, very difficult, very complex thing to do. So if the same would apply to AI. If you were implementing AI in the NHS, you would again run into this problem where you have a real diversity in terms of existing practices within the different local and regional institutions and networks. And so the opportunity that exists if you are implementing AI in less developed countries is if you don't have existing, very well entrenched types of information systems that the AI would be replacing or augmenting, then you can actually have more of a singular vision, I suppose, in terms of what the AI is supposed to do and how it's designed. And it's the difference between trying to fit AI over a very complex space versus designing AI to fill a gap in terms of the services that are offered in the country or the infrastructure that's available in the country. So there is that's an opportunity that's unique to developed countries that doesn't exist, or sorry, unique for developing countries that doesn't necessarily exist for developed countries. The short way to put it is, things can be much more complicated when you're implementing AI in a developed country when you have to interact with the existing institutions and systems that are already in place.
Final question, what possible measures or recommendations do you propose to enable efficient use of AI and emerging technologies in achieving SDG 10?
So I suppose the main thing, and the thing that's been ignored up to this point, is to just ensure that we are using AI in a way, and emerging technologies in general, in a way that complies with our existing systems of regulation and law. We have, long-standing legal and regulatory frameworks that essentially capture the values of a society and try to operationalize them into rules that institutions and people should follow within that society. And for some reason, quite often, at least with any new, very innovative technology, it doesn't start from a point of trying to comply with those legal frameworks. Rather, it's quite often disrupting them or just ignoring them altogether. And so we've seen this in the space of, say, non-discrimination law and data protection law in Europe and in the UK, where the systems were seen as very disruptive and not necessarily compliant with those different legal frameworks. So that concept I mentioned earlier, the difference between formal equality, substantive equality, bias preserving fairness metrics, bias transforming fairness metrics, it's exactly that sort of problem. It's how do you have an AI system? How do you measure fairness within that AI system in a way that follows the values and the values of society that are embedded in our existing legal frameworks around non-discrimination. And that's a very important thing to do to basically to be compliant with local or regional regulation, and therefore to adhere to the values of those societies. because AI is something that can be developed in one place and then transported to another place very easily. You can often get a mismatch between the context in which the system was designed or trained and the place in which it is ultimately used. And in the space of fairness and equality in AI, we certainly see that where the vast majority of work to date has emerged from the United States and reflects to some extent anti-discrimination law and anti-discrimination legal frameworks and just historical lessons from the United States, which is not necessarily the right approach or doesn't necessarily align well with the same lessons and the same legal frameworks as they exist in other countries, in this case, say the European Union and the United Kingdom. So I think paying attention to local values, both ethical and legal, and looking at how they're embedded in existing frameworks, whether they be human rights or more frameworks like data protection, privacy, and non-discrimination, is very important. And it's something that we need to be very vigilant about going forward if we're going to achieve SDG 10 across very different societies.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Brent and Mittelstadt. Your views contribute greatly to our final report on AI and SDG 10. I hope our AI policy labs can continue to cooperate with you in the future. And our videos will be uploaded to the website. If you want to see the contact before uploading or you have any question, please contact me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.